Every town has that one place spoken about only in whispers, an abandoned house wrapped in legends, fears, and unexplained mysteries. People are too afraid to even glance its way, yet there are always those who feel drawn to such fear. This is the story of one such soul, a man who decided to prove to himself and others that there was nothing to be afraid of. But what he witnessed inside changed him forever. Some doors are better left unopened. You'll feel the tension. You'll hear fear whispering in your ear. And by the end of the story, you'll have to answer just one question. Would you dare to step inside? It was just another ordinary night, or so he thought, until the moment the door closed behind him on its own. Our protagonist, Alex, was always drawn to places that others avoided. For him, it wasn't fear. It was a challenge, a chance to test himself and uncover secrets hidden in the shadows. Bunwood Manor, overgrown with ivy, shrouded in the shadow of trees, and steeped in chilling legends passed down through generations. Stories of disappearances, strange noises, and even ghosts terrified everyone, except Alex. They warned him not to go, claiming that some things are better left undisturbed. But Alex had a different perspective. To him, it was just another urban legend waiting to be debunked. His heart was racing, faster than he'd like to admit. Was it fear, or perhaps excitement for the unknown? He didn't know yet, but this night would change his life forever. As he made his way to Bunwood Manor, Alex noticed the little things that unsettled him. The silence was too deep, and each step sounded louder than it should. But he kept moving forward, undeterred. There it stood, a place that seemed to be waiting for him. Its crumbling walls hid secrets no one dared to uncover. But Alex wasn't planning to turn back. From that moment on, everything changed. Alex didn't know yet, but something inside was already waiting for him. As Alex stepped through the creaking door, he was met with an overwhelming chill, the kind that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. The air inside was damp, heavy with the scent of decay and forgotten years. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a corridor lined with peeling wallpaper and shattered frames dangling from rusted nails. Every step he took echoed ominously, as though the house was whispering back to him. He stopped for a moment, his breath shallow. The silence wasn't just ordinary, it was oppressive, unnatural. He could almost feel it pressing against his ears, drowning out even the faintest sound from the outside world. It was as if the house had swallowed him whole, isolating him from reality. Alex shook his head, forcing himself to move forward. To his left, a door hung slightly ajar, the wood splintered as though someone or something had tried to claw their way through. Against his better judgment, he pushed it open. The room was small, cluttered with rotting furniture and scattered debris. In the corner, a rocking chair swayed gently, its rhythmic creak slicing through the suffocating silence. He froze, the beam of his flashlight fixed on the chair. It wasn't the wind, it couldn't be. The air was still, and yet the chair moved, as if inviting him to come closer. He took a hesitant step forward, and the creaking stopped abruptly. The stillness was deafening. From somewhere deeper in the house, a faint sound broke the silence. A whisper. It was so soft that Alex almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, unmistakably human. Leave. The word sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. Alex tightened his grip on the flashlight, scanning the room, but there was no one there. Just the lingering echo of that single, chilling word. He stepped back into the corridor, his heart pounding. The whispers grew louder now, more urgent, their source impossible to pinpoint. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, surrounding him, filling the air with an otherworldly presence. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered, the beam dimming and brightening erratically. Panic began to creep in as darkness closed around him. He smacked the flashlight against his palm, willing it to stay on, but it was no use. The light died completely, plunging him into blackness. That's when he heard it. A soft, deliberate tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. It started slowly, then picked up speed, growing louder and louder until it was almost deafening. Alex spun around, desperate to find the source, but the darkness was impenetrable. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the tapping stopped. In its place came a low, guttural breathing, so close it felt as if it was right behind him. Alex didn't dare turn around. He couldn't. His legs felt like lead, frozen in place by a terror he'd never known before. The breathing grew louder, each exhale brushing against the back of his neck. He could feel it cold and damp, as if whatever was there wanted him to know it was real. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex spun around, swinging the flashlight like a weapon. The beam flickered back to life for a brief second, illuminating the face of something that wasn't human. Pale, hollow eyes stared back at him, their gaze piercing and unrelenting. Its twisted, gaunt face was only inches away, lips parted in a sinister grin that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. And then it was gone. The flashlight steadied, its beam revealing nothing but the empty corridor. Alex stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced, questioning what he'd just seen. Was it real, or was the house playing tricks on him? He didn't have time to wonder. A loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and far too close. "Who's there?" Alex shouted, his voice cracking. The only response was the sound of a door slamming shut somewhere above him. He wanted to leave, to turn around and run, but something held him there, an invisible force that compelled him to continue. Against every instinct screaming at him to flee, Alex climbed the staircase, each creak of the old wood amplifying his dread. Whatever was waiting for him upstairs, he knew one thing for certain. It wasn't going to let him leave so easily. As Alex reached the top of the staircase, the air grew heavier, colder, as if every step brought him closer to something he shouldn't find. The hallway stretched before him, shrouded in shadows that seemed to move and twist on their own. Faint scratches marred the walls, lines that looked more like desperate messages than accidental marks. His flashlight flickered again, weak and unreliable, its beam trembling like his hands. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. Pale light seeped through the crack, faint and unnatural, casting long, distorted shadows onto the floor. Alex swallowed hard, his throat dry. That light, it didn't belong here. "Keep going," he whispered to himself, as if his own voice could drown out the pounding of his heart. He forced his feet to move, each step heavier than the last, until he stood before the door. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room inside was small, barren except for a single chair in the center. On it sat a faded doll, its porcelain face cracked, one glass eye missing. The other eye stared at him, lifeless yet somehow aware. Alex felt the weight of its gaze as though it was watching him, judging him for his intrusion. And then, the door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed like a gunshot, reverberating through the room. Alex spun around, gripping the flashlight tightly. There was no one there, no breeze to explain the sudden movement, just the suffocating silence. But then he heard it, a faint giggle, high-pitched, childlike, and coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. His breath caught in his throat as the doll's head tilted slightly, its single eye locking onto his. Alex staggered back, his legs trembling. The giggle turned into a soft hum, a haunting melody that filled the room. It was the kind of tune you'd sing to a child before bed, sweet, but wrong somehow, laced with something sinister. "Who's there?" Alex shouted, his voice shaking. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound. The creaking of footsteps on the wooden floor, circling him, though he could see no one. "Get out!" A voice hissed, low and venomous, sending a chill racing down his spine. Alex turned wildly, the flashlight sweeping through the empty room. The shadows on the walls seemed to ripple, growing darker, deeper, as if the room itself was closing in around him. And then he saw her. In the corner of the room, a figure began to take shape. A woman, pale and translucent, her long hair hanging like a curtain over her face. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though her neck had been snapped. She stood there, unmoving, her presence filling the air with an unbearable tension. "Leave," she whispered again, her voice echoing like a gust of icy wind. Alex tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot, frozen under her gaze, or what should have been her gaze. Her face, though faintly visible, was wrong. Empty. Hollow. A void where her features should have been. The humming started again, louder this time, and the woman began to move. Slowly, unnaturally, her limbs jerking as though pulled by invisible strings. Alex's mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body refused. All he could do was watch as she approached, her movements disjointed, her presence suffocating. She stopped inches from him, her hollow face tilting upward to meet his gaze. The flashlight in his hand flickered violently, casting erratic beams of light across the room. And then, without warning, she reached out, her hand cold and skeletal, and touched his chest. Pain shot through Alex's body like lightning, his chest burning as if her touch had ignited something within him. He gasped for air, his vision blurring, the room spinning around him. "You shouldn't have come," she hissed, her voice layered with countless others, a cacophony of anger and despair. Her hand pressed harder against him, and for a moment, Alex thought it was the end. But then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. She was gone. The room was empty. The doll lay on the floor, shattered, its lifeless eyes staring up at him. Alex stumbled back, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. The flashlight steadied, its beam revealing only the emptiness of the room. But the house was not silent. Faint whispers echoed through the walls, a chorus of voices too distant to understand but impossible to ignore. Alex knew he wasn't alone. Not really. Whatever haunted this place, it wasn't finished with him yet. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Alex staggered toward the door. His only thought was escape. But as his hand touched the doorknob, a new sound froze him in place. A low, guttural growl, coming from just behind him. Alex didn't dare turn around. The growl, low and menacing, felt like it was crawling up his spine, every vibration drilling into his bones. His hand gripped the doorknob so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He twisted it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. The door refused to open, trapping him in the clutches of whatever horror loomed behind him. The growling stopped. Silence. But this wasn't the absence of sound. It was the kind of silence that suffocates, that makes you hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat. It was worse than the noise because it meant whatever was behind him was waiting. "Please," Alex whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was begging. Himself, the house, or whatever entity had claimed him. The doorknob twisted suddenly, violently, as though something on the other side was fighting to keep him in. Then, a voice. "You can't leave." It was cold, hollow, and full of malice. It sounded close, impossibly close, as though it came from within his own mind. Alex slammed his shoulder against the door, again and again, until finally, it gave way. He stumbled into the hallway, nearly losing his footing, but he didn't stop. His legs carried him forward, driven by pure survival instinct. The whispers started again, louder now, an angry cacophony that seemed to pour out of the walls. "Leave. D." The voices overlapped, contradictory and chaotic, as though the house itself couldn't decide what it wanted from him. Alex didn't care. He ran. Down the corridor, toward the staircase, the old wood groaning under his frantic steps. The shadows seemed to move with him, chasing him, closing in. He reached the top of the stairs, his breath ragged, his vision blurring from panic. And then he saw it. At the bottom of the staircase stood a figure. It was the woman again, her head tilted, her hollow face turned upward, waiting. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her, more figures began to emerge from the darkness. Twisted, shadowy shapes with glowing eyes and grotesque smiles. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching him, blocking his path. "How?" Alex's voice broke, trembling with terror. He turned, searching for another way, but the hallway behind him was no longer empty. The shadows had taken form, growing and stretching into something almost human but not quite. He was surrounded. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping until they were no longer words but a constant, piercing noise. His head pounded, his chest heaved, and his legs threatened to give out beneath him. Alex fell to his knees, his flashlight rolling away and casting wild beams of light across the walls. "Help me," he murmured, though he knew there was no one to hear him. The house wanted him. It had always wanted him. But then, through the chaos, he saw it. A glimmer of hope. The front door, slightly ajar. The faint glow of moonlight spilling through. It wasn't possible. He hadn't left it open. But he didn't care. With every ounce of strength he had left, Alex pushed himself to his feet and ran. The figures reached for him, their twisted arms stretching unnaturally long, their fingers brushing against his skin as he sprinted past them. The whispers turned to screams, a furious roar of anger and despair that chased him down the stairs. He reached the door, threw it open, and burst into the night. The cold air hit him like a wave, sharp and biting, but it was real. He could breathe again. The whispers stopped, cut off as if a switch had been flipped. The house loomed behind him, silent and still, as though nothing had ever happened. Alex collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. He turned back, half expecting to see the figures standing in the doorway, watching him. But there was nothing, just the house, dark and lifeless. But as he stared, he noticed something, movement in one of the upper windows. A shadow, faint but unmistakable, standing there, watching him. Alex didn't wait to see more. He staggered to his feet and ran, leaving Bunwood Manor behind. But as he disappeared into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't truly escaped. The house had let him go, for now. And somewhere deep within the shadows of Bunwood Manor, a soft, childlike giggle echoed once more. Alex never returned to Bunwood Manor. He didn't need to. The memories of that night stayed with him, a haunting reminder of what he'd encountered. He tried to convince himself it was all in his head, that the fear, the shadows, the voices were just tricks of the mind. But deep down, he knew the truth. Bunwood Manor wasn't just a house. It was something alive, something that had watched him, followed him, and maybe let him go. But as Alex tried to move on, there were nights when he'd wake in a cold sweat, certain he'd heard that faint, childlike giggle somewhere nearby. And sometimes, in the silence of his room, he could swear he felt a presence, lingering just out of sight. The world is filled with places like Bunwood Manor, dark corners where the veil between this life and the next feels impossibly thin. And not all who wander into such places make it back to tell their story. Next time, we'll explore a new kind of terror, a story tied to something far more personal, a mirror, a reflection that shows more than just your face. What happens when the glass becomes a window into something else entirely? If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. This is just the beginning of the stories we'll uncover here at HorrorHaven. Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe. Or, at the very least, stay in the light.